Thank you all for coming today. It's delightful to have you here.
My name is Kathy Kramer. I coordinate the Bringing Back the Natives Garden Tour. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
So it's my pleasure now to introduce Doug Tallamy, professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. A man of many talents, Dr. Tallamy is not only an accomplished researcher, but also the best-selling author of Nature's Best Hope and Bringing Nature Home. I hope you enjoy his presentation, Nature's Best Hope. Right, Talk? Okay, thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody. We're going to talk about my idea of what nature's best hope is. We need a lot of hope these days, but I'll give you a spoiler. You are nature's best hope. You knew that. So I'm really going to talk about why I think you're nature's best hope. But before we do that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. He, of course, it's the late E.O. Wilson, unfortunately. He died the day after Christmas almost 3 years ago. And he had an extremely long, successful career at Harvard. And one thing that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of life on planet Earth and his efforts to save it. And he wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it's going to disappear everywhere, and that includes humans. Very bold statement. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are in trouble can be in that half. We'll be in the other half. It'll be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And I don't see that disappearing anytime soon. And we've got 8.2 billion people. Billion. Remember what a billion is? It's 1,000 million. A lot of people on the Earth with all of our hardscape, airports, detritus, and we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? That's really what I want to talk about today. And I think we can, but we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened, at least on the East Coast, where I come from, in 2019, then again 2 or 3 years later, and then this last one, I think it happened last year, happened almost across the country. There was a very large oak mast. Members of particularly the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And that's what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze, but once it's out of the acorn, it's a very dangerous time for that larva because it's good to eat. So a lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And then within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly, stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do. But you can't see it. Their mouth parts are all the way down at the end of that extension. That's an extension of the head capsule. And they take those mouth parts, they chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year the way most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, leaves a hole. It's kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants. Tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they've left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move the colony, grab the larvae, grab the eggs, move the entire colony into that new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. And after they're in there, they post a guard, a little hole or a little antennae up there. Make sure nobody else comes into that hole. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until that acorn falls apart. What's my point with that little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns, jays of all the species. They're the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, they'll fly up to a mile, maybe a mile and a half from the parent tree, and they tap it below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. And a single jay can bury 4,500 acorns every fall. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants. You won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have the beloved E. marginia, beautiful moth, unless you have mistletoe. And you won't have mistletoe unless you have the oaks that mistletoe infest, whatever you want to call it. Another specialized relationship. That is the only plant that beautiful moth can develop on. You won't have 60 species of bees in California if you don't have perennial sunflowers. We've got between 3,600 and 4,000 species of bees in North America. California has 1,600, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So nature is a series of very specialized relationships. But the point I want to make this afternoon is that many, actually most these days, most of these relationships are in trouble. They're on the ropes. Nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country, particularly the lower 48 states, as it was. There's only about 5% that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We've polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need, because it is nature that sustains us on planet Earth. So why have we done this? I don't know. But I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we're wrong about that. That's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds. There's that word billion again. 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population, already gone. And now the UN's predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. And they made that prediction 3 years ago. So I guess it's the next 17 years now. It is a prediction. Hasn't happened yet. And we have to make sure it doesn't happen, because these, again, are the species that run the ecosystems that keep us alive on this planet. It's serious stuff. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talks about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Should we turn briefly to this headline, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what would happen if insects disappeared from Earth, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. We would lose the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And again, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. The top grouping there is just some of the things that plants do every day that we depend on every day, like oxygen. Pretty important. Plants are producing that oxygen. They're cleaning our water and slowing its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants, of course, they build their tissues out of carbon, pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, build their tissues with it, and then deposit the extra carbon that they fix through photosynthesis into the soil through their root system. And once it's in the soil, it's extremely stable. Plants are building topsoil, holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather. They're converting sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and then we'll lose weight. What are animals doing? Particularly for plants, they're providing pest control services. They're pollinating nearly 90% of the plants that are out there. They're dispersing plant seeds. So designing landscapes like that that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. It never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8.1, 8.2 billion people that are requiring more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can, but we're in the 6th great extinction event the planet has ever experienced, which means it's not good enough. We're now going to have to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like that. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s, and one of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Have been indigenous groups, been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we were clever enough to learn how to use the land without spoiling it. That's what he called land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together, we cannot coexist in the same place at the same time, that notion is so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day. It's still embedded in our own culture. He might not have recognized it as an option. So what I want to argue this afternoon is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Edwin Wade Teal, decades ago, said, we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It is the most basic common sense. So where should we start? Well, I think we should start on private property because most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. And failure's not an option, by the way. So when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. That's been our conservation model for the last century, and we want to keep doing that. But it's obviously not good enough. So we have to go beyond conservation now into restoration. We have to put nature back in as many places as we possibly can. And you might be thinking, well, there's no way you can restore nature exactly the way it was before we wrecked it. And you're probably right. We've changed too many things. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions that I opened the talk with to create functional ecosystems once again, even if it's not exactly what was on that particular space at some point in the past. But in order to do that, we need to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most important groups, and there's two groups we can't do without. One, of course, is the flowering plants and those pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They're capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So now we have the food that animals need locked up in plant tissue, mostly leaves. If you don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, you don't have functional ecosystems. And surprisingly, it turns out that most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. It turns out that caterpillars are enormously important in terms of transferring energy from plants to other animals. They're transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes without a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That is the chickadee that lives in my yard and throughout the southeast. It, of course, is a bird at our feeders. There's chickadees all over the country. You've got the black-capped chickadee and the chestnut-backed chickadee. They come to our feeders and they eat seeds, and we tend to think that's all the chickadees need. But even in the wintertime, only 50% of the chickadees' diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch entirely to invertebrates, and if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So why caterpillars? Something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beak's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Oops. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. They're very nutritious. They're high in fat, high in protein. They're low percentage. They have a low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to most other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have really sharp edges too. Then finally, they are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. You don't love organic chemistry? Yeah. I'm a vertebrate, you're a vertebrate, birds are vertebrates. We vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from, particularly during the breeding season? From all those things they bring back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey items. Those two bars all the way on the left are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. The adult caterpillars, the moths and butterflies themselves, you can see where that little butterfly is, have far fewer carotenoids because they don't eat green leaves. The carotenoids are in the green leaves. And the earthworm, all the way over there on the right, The early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. And it turns out there's a direct correlation, very strong correlation, between the frequency with which a prey item is brought back to the nest and its carotenoid content. Caterpillars are brought back more often than any other type of prey, and they've got the highest carotenoid content, followed by orthopteroids, things like crickets and grasshoppers and katydids, and then all the other prey down here with low carotenoid content are not brought back that often. So those studies and others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of most bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? Or 1 or 2 a day enough? It's a good question. So let's go back to Carolina chickadee. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a Carolina chickadee? 1 or 2 is not enough. 1 or 2 a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, and that depends on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count them. But you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to get one clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce to the point where they are independent, and after they're independent, they continue to eat caterpillars. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do, because in so many places, that's all we have is our yards, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard. A chickadee forages about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot, and that is true for most of the birds that are out there. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's one of the major reasons we believe that birds are declining. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al., that is the Smithsonian group who said we've lost 3 billion breeding birds, and we divided those, the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. The species that require insects, that's the bar on the left, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects when they're breeding, and that's the bar on the right. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually reproduce on a little milk they make out of seeds, and they regurgitate that to their offspring. So they don't need insects. And look, those species did not, there was no reduction in their populations at all in the last 50 years. But the species that require insects lost, on average, 10 million individuals per species. So it doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. And it's not just little birds that eat caterpillars. Big birds do too. This is a kestrel eating a sphinx moth. And it's not just birds that need caterpillars. This is the ornate box turtle in the Midwest. They chase armyworm and cutworm populations around and eat hundreds of caterpillars a day when they get the chance. Lots of things depend on caterpillars. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do 2 things, be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. That is the new horticultural challenge. But you're not going to make them ecologically functional without putting the caterpillars back. So how do you add caterpillars to residential landscapes? You put the plants that support those caterpillars into those landscapes, which seems pretty straightforward, pretty easy. But there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to be fussy about which plants we choose for our landscapes, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the eucalyptus and all the crepe myrtle and all the ginkgos and all the hostas and all the things we typically landscape with from other countries in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That is host plant specialization, and it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Well, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty-tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. And if you don't believe me, after the talk, go out and eat a plant. See if you like it. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. But insects do eat plants, so how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. They can only eat the plants for which they have adaptations that allow them to get around those chemical defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history interacting with particular plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So it turns out that this is actually very simple. There are three kinds of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur in North America is one of our oaks. And you Californians are blessed with a number of species of wonderful oaks. They are contributing more energy to local food webs than any other plant genus by far. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental plant, has good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo, so it's not adding any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a detractor would be any of our invasive plants from other continents that are very poor at supporting local insects. They're not adding energy to the food web. But they also escape where we plant them and push out the plants that do add energy. So the net result is a loss of energy from the local food web. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. We cannot rebuild nature. We cannot reconstruct ecosystems if we don't have viable food webs in those ecosystems. And we're not going to have viable food webs in those ecosystems unless we choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when we do choose the right plants, starting with my house, our house. My wife wants me to call it our house. Just because she paid for it. You know? That's where we live, Oxford, Pennsylvania. We moved in 2020. It's now 24 years ago, I guess. It was an old farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. And by old, I mean it was almost 300 years old. Soil was exhausted. And the last thing I did was mow it for hay. So there are very few plants there. And our job was to put it back together again, rebuild that ecosystem, which we had never done and we didn't know how to do. But it seemed like a nice challenge anyway. And I wanted to see what if I planted the host plant of one of those caterpillars that needs a particular plant, would that species come and colonize that particular plant? And the first one I tried was the Canadian owlet. I'd never seen a Canadian owlet before. People say, why'd you choose a Canadian owlet? I was looking through Dave Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America, and I said, that's a pretty one. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. That's their host plant. We didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure it was there 300 years ago before the area was farmed to death, but the meadow rue was long gone. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and I planted them, and they grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue, so I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. When I was walking by for another reason, I looked over. It was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So we've added 2 species to the property. We've got a good population of Canadian owlets and a good population of meadow rue. The restoration has begun. Same with the goldenrod stowaway. It's actually a misnomer. That beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on that plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but I did know where there were some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last year they took over my front yard. That's okay. Well, I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens, but they did. And now we have a good population of both of those. So we've added 4 species to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. Wanted to see if the hackberry emperor could make a living at our house, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be there, but as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got a couple hackberry trees, I planted them. Had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry, but they did. Now we've got a good population of both of those creatures, and we've got added 6 species to the property. That's how the restoration proceeded. We did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidura flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths that use goldenrod in the mid-Atlantic states. I also planted Virginia creeper. Now, back east, when I say that, people groan. They don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. It makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall, and by valuable I mean they're high in fat. Our migrating birds need sources of fat to fuel that migration, and our overwintering birds need sources of fat to get through the winter. And those berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know when Virginia creeper's in bloom. But you know it when there's a big cloud of native bees around it. It's a wonderful pollinator plant. So when you're making a pollinator garden, remember you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth to make a living in our house, because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, we didn't have any evening primrose, and that's what it depends on, so I planted it, and the moth did come. It spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oak trees. Now, these are just examples of the lineages we put back in our yard. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. That's the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy it when it's 400 years old, you're right. You won't. But if you can enjoy your oak, what your oak is contributing to your local food web, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, free, or as 2-foot bare root whips. Wait, we haven't gotten to the good part yet. And immediately, they started to call in the moths that create the caterpillars to support the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the Suzuki's promolactus, red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more have come to the oaks on our tree. I love it when people clap for the oaks. They are the best. Look, they come right away. This is a pin oak that's just popped its head above the leaves, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. And people say, oh, no, he's going to kill the tree. No, an ovenbird's going to come and eat it in the next 20 minutes. That's part of a food web, and you didn't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to create that food web. By the way, you've got some real cool moths and butterflies and caterpillars here in the West, too. Dave Wagner's been working on the caterpillars of Western North America for 15 years, whatever. I say, when are you going to finish? He says, never. You've got a lot. And this is just a few. We don't even know what their names are, but they're very, very cool things. So I don't want you to think that everything's in the East. It's really not. You actually have a lot more species out here than we do. So the question is, has life returned to our property? And it's just an example. You can do this right here. And you can measure life any way you want. You can count the number of breeding birds on your property, and we're doing that. But I'm also counting the number of moth species that have come back. Remember, moths are the bread and butter of terrestrial food webs. And I'm counting them by taking a picture of them. I'm still at it, been doing it for 8 years, but I'm up to 1,336. I got another species since I sent this PowerPoint to Kathy. We've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania's 29.2 million acres. So in one tiny, tiny, tiny slice of Pennsylvania, we've got 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of them are types of bird food, we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Why are they breeding there? Because the bird food's there. When you put out a bird feeder, the birds come. Why am I telling you this? This is another headline we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn these headlines around. But will it work on smaller properties? That's a good question. Everybody doesn't have 10 acres. How about in suburbia? Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development, surrounded by everybody with the big lawns. When they moved into their property, it was totally choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, another serious invasive. So they got rid of that. They planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler, and then they started to count the birds that are using their property. They're still at it, but they're up to, that is so far behind, 157 bird species that have used their property, including 35 warbler species. So just to put that in perspective, we're actually up to 18 warbler species now, but the Terpstras are way ahead of us. So does it work on smaller properties? Yes, it does. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, her property abuts O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not attached to any natural area at all. She's an island, a tiny island of habitat in the middle of Chicago. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper. She knows how to do it. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature, and then she sat back, she says, with a glass of wine, and started to count the birds using her property. She's up to, it's actually 125 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. Okay, there's 4 things we need to do if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we need to succeed in a big way, and one of those things is to address those big lawns, and I know you guys don't have big lawns, but there are some people in California that do, and one of them is named Kim Kardashian. Is she here? She has the largest lawn in California. You might send her an email. We got 44 million acres of lawn in this country. It's a national problem, and it's dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? Well, it's a status symbol, and we like neat, and we have to display our Halloween decorations. There are 4 things every property has to accomplish, 4 ecological goals. If we're going to reach a sustainable relationship with the nature that supports us, every landscape has to support a viable food web. Every landscape has to sequester carbon. Every landscape has to clean and manage the watershed in which it lies. And every landscape has to support pollinators. Lawn does none of those things, which is why I keep picking on it. So let's reduce the area of lawn. Notice I'm not saying get rid of it. It's the perfect plant to walk on. And it's a cue for care. You can actually reduce your lawn without being thrown out of your neighborhood if you do it cleverly. But let's take areas like this and turn them into that. I got this picture from Dan Getman in Missouri. I used to say I never met Dan, but I actually did meet him a couple of weeks ago. Nice guy. Anyway, he had this giant lawn, and he's putting the plants back, and he wanted me to see it. Okay, well, let's say we got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to keep the math simple. We're going to cut that in half. That will give us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home, which is enough to create what we're calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put a park at home? What do you get when you put some part of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to interact with it. All you have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out your window. You can do it at your own time, your own pace. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, last year, 375 million people there with you. I know what you're really going to interact with. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike or government closure happens. No travel hassles, which to somebody like me is important. You get to experience the natural world alone. And that's also important. You're going to develop a relationship with Mother Nature, maybe rekindle one you had as a child, maybe develop it for the first time. Just you and Mother Nature. It's not going to be mediated by somebody else. And it's particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour. They go to a natural area. They walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home, and that is their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing, but it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it, become familiar with it, fall in love with it, alone, no parental supervision. When we hover over our kids as parents, we're sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. This is something you should be afraid of. Our kids are afraid enough already. It's a terrible message to send to the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know what good stewardship is, if they don't love being a good steward, they'll be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a piece of lawn with a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to tell me very seriously how you hunt lizards. You get in the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. And you crawl very slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of that lizard. You learn how to be a good steward of that piece of nature. And you fall in love with that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. You sent me this picture not long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember these interactions with nature. And I guarantee they're going to help her be a good steward of the planet when she gets a little older. And Homegrown National Park's a real thing now. It's a small nonprofit. You can join it. What you do is go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the biodiversity map. And what that means is you put down your location and you're making a pledge or recording what you've already done in terms of good earth stewardship. Maybe you really are going to reduce the amount of lawn you are. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. It doesn't matter how modest it is, but you're going to record that area in the database, and then your piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly. And you get to see how many other people in your county here have joined Homegrown National Park. And of course, the object is to get the whole country to light up with a firefly. What's our mission? We want to motivate millions of people, the millions and millions and millions of people out there that don't know they are the future of conservation. We want to motivate them to regenerate biodiversity in the way that you regenerate biodiversity. You put the native plants that support it back, you remove the non-native plants that don't, and you build a culture that's sympathetic to the needs of conservation. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one is a significant increase of biodiversity. When I think of what's happened at our house, it convinces me this works. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody got rid of the invasive plants just on their property, we'd be 78% done nationwide. 85% done in the east. That's a very good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant for sequestering carbon. So if you replace it with anything else, you have helped climate change. You've helped stop climate change. And you're starting to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of conservation we do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. There are also really important sociological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one is national awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's essential. It's essential for everybody, and that means everybody owns responsibility to help sustain it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge all the existing conservation organizations into one visual, the biodiversity map. So Audubon and National Wildlife Federation and all the Land Conservancy, Sierra Club, all on the same page here. Remember the 30 by 30 initiative, going to save 30% of the U.S. by 2030. It's not going to happen if we don't record the good conservation that's happening on private property, because most of the country is privately owned. Did I mention that Homegrown National Park is free? All you have to do is go to the website and register your property. We're not trying to pull membership away from any other organization. We're not competing with them. We are on the same page. So once you reduce your lawn, what plants are you going to put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to make an argument that should be what we're calling a keystone plant. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Remember, it's caterpillars that are driving that food web. Our keystone plants, it's just 14% of all the native plants that are out there. They're supporting 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They're the support system. Your house will fall down without them. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. As I said, oaks, a #1 keystone plant across the country, wherever they occur. In California, they support 270 species of caterpillars, over 950 species across the country. Again, no other plant genus comes close to that. How do you find out what the best plants are where you live? You folks in California are really lucky because you have Calscape. That is the best source. All of your native plants are geo-referenced. You know exactly where they are in relation to where you live. It's got data about how many species of caterpillars those plants support. So the old excuse of not knowing what to plant, that's just an excuse now. Go to Calscape, you do know what to plant. Okay, we're going to reduce the lawn. We're going to use keystone plant. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. It turns out that light pollution is a major cause of insect decline. It may be the biggest major cause of insect decline. Those are all the ways that lights are killing our insects at night. But to me, this is good news. This is good news because it's got a very simple solution. You just flick a switch. There are a lot of switches to flick, but there's a lot of us to flick those switches. And I know you're going to say, well, I can't turn the light out over my barn or over my front porch or my garage because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And if you don't want to do that, even easier, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. Fortunately, nocturnal insects are not attracted by yellow wavelengths. So if we make the nighttime yellow, we really can turn this around. Overnight, we could save millions of insects. And if we use yellow LEDs, and by the way, you can go to the hardware store and buy what they call a bug light. It's yellow for exactly this purpose. So we'd save millions of insects, and if we use LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars too. So we're going to shrink the lawn, we're going to use keystone plants, we're going to modify our light system, then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all of our insects. Booming business around the country. I said Mosquito Joe, but there's lots of companies out there spraying mosquitoes. And they say it's okay because what we're spraying is an organic, natural product. and it certainly sounds wonderful. But cyanide is an organic natural product, and so is ricin, so are lots of really toxic things. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. You know, who wouldn't hire somebody that's only going to kill mosquitoes with something that's organic and natural? Everybody would hire them, and everybody is hiring them. Well, that last part is, it's blatant false advertising, and I don't know how they can get away with it. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with, including our poor beleaguered monarchs, including all the pollinators that we're trying to save. And the interesting thing is, it doesn't control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You have to kill 90% of them. These guys kill between 10 and 50%. So that's why they have to keep coming back and back and back and killing your monarchs all over again. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay or some organic matter, leaves, put it out in the sun for a couple days, and it will build up populations of diatoms and algae, and that is what mosquito larvae eat. So any mosquito in your yard that wants to lay her eggs will preferentially lay them in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks. $12 for a season's worth of control. That's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So it's targeted, it's cheap, and if everybody did it, it would really work. Fourth thing we need to do is to landscape, particularly under our trees, in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, this is just an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. But that is an exception. 94% of the caterpillars on the tree finish growing as caterpillars and they drop from the tree. And they either pupate underground, they wiggle their way underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. It's messy. And we mow and compact the areas under our trees so that they're rock hard. So when the caterpillars fall down, they have a very difficult time completing their development. It becomes an ecological trap. And the cement landscape is not the answer either. So this is what most people do. They put a tree in a yard. Now I've got a grad student that's actually finishing up this semester, Emma Jonas, who's been measuring how well caterpillars do in a situation like that, but I guarantee they do better in a layered landscape like that. Heather Holm calls this soft landing. The caterpillars fall down. It's not that it's a soft landing, it's that the ground is not compacted. That is the major feature here, and we're not walking in that area. It turns out that the pressure from a single footfall is, or a lawnmower going in it, is way more than enough to crush a caterpillar pupa, which they go underground, but not very far, just a couple centimeters. So making no-go areas, no-mow areas, and keeping it from being compacted is the way to improve caterpillar survivorship. So what you want to do is create these beds that people aren't going to go in, plant appropriate ground covers, and that changes as you move around the country. But Bearberry manzanita would be a good example, the yerba buena. You've got lots of examples here, and we've just seen plenty of pictures of them. Those are all safe zones for the caterpillars in your trees. Former grad student Desiree Narango did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her results suggest there actually is room for compromise. You don't have to compromise, but there's room for it if you want to. She had one simple question. How well do chickadee populations do in suburban neighborhoods that are where the landscape is dominated with native plants versus yards where they're not, where they're dominated with non-native ornamentals? And when they're dominated with non-native ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So everybody had a nest box up, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here, we're not even going to try to breed. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, so from nothing to 100% woody plant, non-native woody plant biomass. The reason we looked at woody plants is because that's where chickadees forage. They forage on woody plants. And this is what you get. That dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to reproduce to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at that rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, anything above that dotted line there, you have a growing population. But if you're below the dotted line, and that's what happens when you have most of your woody plant biomass non-native, then you have an unsustainable shrinking population. Where those lines intersect, and I can't point to it, right down there you get, it's liberally speaking around 30%. So it means you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without collapsing your local food web. That's the area of compromise. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive species. They're ecological tumors. Somebody sent me an email once that said, can't we tolerate just a few tumors? How many tumors do you want in your body? They grow. That's the problem. They grow. So no, we can't tolerate any, but there's plenty of ornamental plants that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? That big tree over there on the right is a ginkgo. Why does Dan have a ginkgo in his native planting? Well, Dan's wife likes ginkgos. And Dan likes his wife. So he planted a ginkgo. The question is that tree going to destroy the ecological productivity of this yard? No, it's just there. It's just occupying a little bit of space. Is it going to escape and become an invasive in the local woodlot? No, it's not an invasive species. It's just there. So I like to think of plants that are just there as if they're statues, kind of like an ornamental statue. So there you go. There's Dan's statue. If all of Dan's plants were statues, he would not have a functional landscape. But it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys local food webs. It's the absence of the productive natives. If we increase the percentage of those, we can tolerate other plants. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. You don't get more formal than that. That was taken by a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. They love them over there. If the Europeans can love our native plants, maybe we can too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without upsetting anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor that this is intentional. It's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. It's not very big. It could be bigger. But if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? The media will tell you because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Great pollinator plant, by the way. You've got some wonderful options here in California. Your native asters are super, particularly at the end of the season. How about this, a Drew Latham design? It's much bigger than the little fence thing. Imagine the amount of life there versus the amount of life on the lawn next to it. It seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's been doing it for several years now. They've got a cost-sharing program where they're paying homeowners to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Pennsylvania started a similar program. Virginia's starting a similar program. There's an island off of Florida, I think it's Marco Island, that is paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on these invasive ornamentals. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did, Fayetteville, Arkansas, North Carolina. If you take out a calorie pair, you get a free tree replacement. Public utilities giving people $100 coupons to plant water-efficient native plants. And, of course, your lawn reduction programs here in California. That's going up. Now you get $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you replace with a xeric planting. And if you want more information on all of those programs, memorize that. Okay, I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's really serious. We're starting to think that nature is optional. We like nature. We like to walk around in it. We like to see the birds. We like to ride our bikes. But it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our view of our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature. We want to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for expanding the national park system. Beautiful places, we want to save them so that future generations can enjoy them. And I get that, because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is far more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about that, but if we restrict conservation just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail, because those places are now too small and too few and too isolated. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That's a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug, and that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance, and I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch, there's plenty of places where we've destroyed the ecological significance, but every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We got to put the plants back. Not just to make biological corridors that connect the fragments with each other, but to replant, establish viable habitat in all those places where we've destroyed it. And the good news is it's starting to happen. I mean, look at Kathy's discussion of the history of bringing the native plants tour back. I mean, it's wonderful. It's happening here. It's happening in a lot of places. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every person on the planet. But I don't know why, since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody share the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Robert Swan said, the greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it. Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said, the Western Southern mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets. You're taught them. You're taught them. We've been very good at teaching our kids about the rights that they have, but we've been terrible about teaching them and our peers about their obligations to good earth stewardship. It does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live, and if you do, it empowers you. There are more and more people that recognize the planet has some serious issues, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can modify their lights, one person can use keystone plants, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can remove their invasives, one person can fire Mosquito Joe. There's a whole bunch of things that one person can do to totally revitalize the ecosystem productivity on their little piece of the earth. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can manage. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power And we certainly have the responsibility to change landscapes like this into landscapes like this. And whether or not we do so is going to determine the future of nature and ultimately our own future as well. Thanks very much. Thank you. Forgot to tell you about my grandchildren. Thanks very much. We have time for 5 questions or 5 minutes. A couple of questions. Does anybody have a question? Yes.
Are you familiar with revoking Silicon Valley? It's a very well thought out vision of what the Santa Clara Valley could be. Replace our street trees with valley oaks and knotweeds.
Well, I'm not familiar with that specific project, but it's a wonderful idea. Am I familiar with re-oaking Silicon Valley? We want to re-oak Silicon Valley and the rest of California as well. So yeah, great. Anything else? Yes.
Hi. I'm very concerned about global warming. Anybody else? If you plant a tree, you need certain conditions for that young tree to thrive and mature. As the planet heats, are there certain species of trees that are not going to be able to succeed as the planet warms? My kind of message here is, I'm planting trees now while I can still water them and hope that they'll be mature to shade my property when I'm too old to do this anymore. Is it a concern growing a tree now while we still have a planet that's cool enough to plant a tree that can live?
Sure, it's a concern. But if the planet gets so warm that it won't support trees, we're all in big trouble. I mean, so what we need to do, I thought you were going to ask me about assisted migration. Should we be moving trees up from the south that are adapted to warmer climates? I'm not a fan of that, because then you're moving them away from the community they co-evolved with. They won't be as productive as what we need them to be. I am hoping. Now, the trees will be moving north gradually. Those blue jays are going to move those acorns a mile a year, and the ones that are in cooler areas will do better than the ones in hotter areas. So plant communities do change over the surface of the earth. They always have. We're forcing change much faster now than they're used to, but maybe I'm Pollyanna. I don't know. But I think if we get control of the carbon we're putting in the air, it's going to be livable. It's not going to be as great as it could be. But, if you're in a dinghy in the middle of the ocean and it springs a leak, you're going to bail. We're bailing. It's just too early to give up. But I'm not a fan of assisted migration. So, yes.
You drew the distinction between woody shrubs for the in the chickadee study. And I'm wondering if there is a percentage in a landscape between woody shrubs and perennials and annuals that is the most advantageous?
Okay, that's a great question. That research has not been done. We worked with chickadees, one species in one place, at one time. That study needs to be repeated with other bird species in different places. Chickadees forage on woody plants, both shrubs and trees, but balancing between the amount of herbaceous cover and woody cover would depend really on the species that you're trying to favor. There are a lot of birds that forage on the ground. There are a lot of birds that forage on the caterpillars in leaf litter under your trees. Sparrows are always foraging on the ground, so you'd have to do a study designed to address those as well. So I really can't answer your question. You want to get as much biomass into your yard as you possibly can. Thank you very much.